Frank Lloyd Wright was an American architect during the first half of the 20th century. He's often considered one of the greatest influencers on American architecture and design. And he's noted for a number of very well-known and famous buildings, all of which you can see on Google. Two of my favorites are Fallingwater House in Pennsylvania, which has a river running through the house. Probably more famous is the Guggenheim Museum in New York City, sitting right across the street from Central Park. But Frank Lloyd Wright was really known for what was later to become known as the Prairie-style home. It's really his lasting legacy, and it really changed the look of many streets throughout some of the Midwestern states, particularly Illinois, which is where he spent much of his time living in Chicago, as well as neighboring states like Michigan and Wisconsin. But Frank Lloyd Wright was more than just a designer of a building. He was a creator of a world. His design really touched every aspect of a home's exterior and interior. He wasn't just concerned with walls and roofs and floors, but he was involved in all of the design of the furniture, of the lamps, of the lighting. In fact, every single window in every single Frank Lloyd Wright house is unique to his design. Even the color of the grout or the mortar was his decision, and often in his homes, the horizontal grout or mortar is a different color than the vertical to give it sort of this stretched out look. Now, whenever someone commissioned Frank Lloyd Wright to design their home and it was built, they would often have a party to invite their friends, work colleagues, neighbors to come and see their one-of-a-kind Frank Lloyd Wright house. And there are more than one account of having thrown these parties, of inviting Frank Lloyd Wright to be there on that evening, and him spending the entire night rearranging all of the furniture back to where he had originally designed it. Most of the families, upon taking up residence in a house that was fully furnished, would often move things around according to their like and their needs. But Frank Lloyd Wright had concrete purpose for where he had placed a chair, a lamp, or a table. Some say that the real genius behind his design is that the architect never actually left the building. As we come to Exodus chapter 25 this morning, we come to a section in the story of Israel which contains the blueprints for a divinely designed building. More appropriately, a divinely designed tent, the tabernacle. The word tabernacle, I think, probably at first sounds very religious, right? The tabernacle. I mean, we have the Metropolitan Tabernacle over in London, but the word simply means a dwelling place. It is a structure for living in. But this dwelling place here in Exodus 25 has a very unique and special residence. It is the Lord himself. We've mentioned throughout this series the importance of relationship in the story of Exodus. Remember what God said back in Exodus 19:4. I have brought you to myself. But here in Exodus chapter 25, verse 8, we read these extraordinary words. Let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell in their midst. God has come to be with them. God is taking up residence with his people, and it's so unlike the gods of this world, right? The God of Israel, the God of the Bible, is personal. And the way that is seen is the building of and the living in the tabernacle, in this dwelling place. And what we have here in these 3 chapters, again, is a blueprint for the construction of the tabernacle. And just as Frank Lloyd Wright, who was completely immersed in the design of his buildings, will see that the Lord has very specific instructions, elements of design. Yes, that are beautiful, but they are also very purposeful. To the Lord, every detail matters. Every placement is deliberate. Every instruction is to be followed. Now, as we come to these chapters and really what remains in Exodus as a whole, it's important to note that this tabernacle is not the final dwelling place in the story of God. It does play a significant role in Israel's history. It will be with them for about 400 years, but the tabernacle is simply pointing forward. It is a foreshadow of God's presence in Jesus Christ. And so as we study this blueprint today, may we see how it both teaches us about who God is, but also proclaims the good news of the gospel. We're going to read the first 9 verses this morning in preparation for studying these 3 chapters. Exodus 25, verses 1 through 9. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the people of Israel, that they take for me a contribution. From every man whose heart moves him, you shall receive the contribution for me. And this is the contribution that you shall receive from them: gold, silver, and bronze, blue and purple and scarlet yarns and fine twined linen, goat's hair, tanned ram skin, goat skin, acacia wood, oil for the lamps, spices for the anointing oil and for the fragrant incense, onyx stones and stones for setting, for the ephod and for the breastplate, or breastpiece. And let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell in their midst, exactly as I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle and all of its furniture. So you shall make it." As we start this morning, I want us to notice 3 things real quickly that we see in these 9 verses. First, we need to notice the heart that the Lord desires here. The people are called in the beginning of the chapter to contribute the materials that are needed for the building of this project. But notice that it's not compulsory. Rather, it is giving what is needed out of a heart of response. It's not some external form that you must feel pressured to do, but it's a response of love, a response of generosity to what the Lord has given to you. This is what the Lord desires for Israel in their worship, that it comes from the heart. It's the worship that the Lord desires from us as we gather today as his people. And I really love the response of Israel to this verse. We don't see it until Exodus 36, but as the contributions are coming in and Moses is collecting them and they're getting ready to build the tabernacle, Moses says, "The people bring much more than enough for doing the work that the Lord has commanded us to do." Israel gets it, at least here in this moment, that we cannot outgive the Lord. And the response is by contributing to this project, to this building of the tabernacle. So the heart that the Lord desires, the first thing that we see. Secondly, we see the need to notice the provision of the Lord. You might ask the question, where does all this stuff come from? If you're familiar with the story of Exodus, we're only a few weeks from when Israel very quickly left slavery in Egypt. They fled from that place. They've spent the last couple of weeks wandering around in the wilderness. Where are they to get all of these materials? There's no way that they could manufacture them. But if you remember Exodus chapter 12, as they're preparing to leave Egypt, many of the Egyptians, out of the providence of God, give them these goods. So again, we see the Lord's provision. He supplies them with more than that which is needed. Thirdly, we notice that this is a special place. As we'll come to see, maybe you've read through these chapters this week, this is no Van Gogh tent that you buy at Go Outdoors and use just for a couple of weekends every year. As you look through this, as you study this, this is an impressive and magnificent dwelling. It is beautiful and it is sacred. The Lord calls it there at the end of the verses that we read a sanctuary. It is a holy place. And the people of Israel are to take this serious. They are to see and understand the significance of the tabernacle. It's to be central to their lives, not just religiously, but even in their daily lives. This tabernacle, this holy dwelling place is to be in their midst. It's reminding them that life revolves around the worship of God. What is the chief end of man? To glorify God. Well, with that, we're going to take a tour of this tabernacle. And this is fairly long section, as I mentioned. It's almost 100 verses, and sometimes when we read it, we might get a bit lost. We might get a little bit bored. There's all of these intricate details of how to assemble things, how to build things, even materials that maybe we're unfamiliar with, have never heard of. We don't even know what they are. And it can be hard to imagine or picture what this building and its furniture looked like. And so for a time, in the beginning here, we're going to take a quick overview of the tabernacle. We're going to use some images that have been put together by scholars, again, to help us see this. They're not necessarily exact representations, but hopefully will give us somewhat of a picture of what this complex, this dwelling place, looked like. But more importantly, as we move on from that, we want to see how these pieces, how this dwelling teaches us about God and the gospel. To begin, we're going to look at the overall site, what we're going to call the courtyard and the tabernacle. This would sort of be the entire dwelling place, the entire tabernacle complex. And it's described for us, the courtyard, in Exodus 27, verses 9 through 19. It's a property, as we see in the image there, surrounded by a wall or a fence. This wall is made of fine linen. It's held together by wooden poles and connections which are made of silver and copper. Its overall dimensions are 46 meters long by 23 meters wide. So it's not a massive area. It's about half the size of a football pitch. The wall was about 2.5 meters in height, clearly establishing a perimeter that could be seen and known that there is a wall here. It was made of fine linen, making it stand out. At the end, at the one entrance there, which always faced east, was linen which was also dyed, sort of setting it apart from the rest of the wall. While this wall was in place, it wasn't high enough to block the view inside. People could see what was going on in there. They knew what was inside the courtyard. Within the walls, there are three key features. There is the altar, which is the first thing upon entering the entrance, followed by the bronze basin, and then the tabernacle itself. We'll zoom in a little bit on the tabernacle as we continue looking at the description of this. You can find this in Exodus 26, verses 1 through 37. This was the only structure, the only building, and although it was relatively small, about 13.5 meters long, 4.5 meters wide, and 4.5 meters high, it was beautiful, and it was extremely important. It was the focal point of the entire complex. It began as a framed structure, so we can kind of see there the walls are made out of acacia wood, a wood that would have been easily found, long-lasting, and this frame would have been held together by long poles of wood that would have been covered in gold. So you kind of see those horizontal lines represent wooden poles holding this structure together. Once this frame was constructed, it was then covered with 4 layers of fabric. And we kind of see those displayed there. The first layer was only visible on the inside. And the description that we have for it is that it is a fine linen curtain. It is dyed blue and purple. It's stitched together with scarlet yarn. And the individual panels are held together by golden clasps. And so we're starting to see that beauty inside the tabernacle. The second layer was a curtain of goat's hair, coupled together by bronze clasps, and this would cover the entire first layer so that was not visible from the outside. The third layer is that of tanned ram skins, most likely as a waterproof material, keeping out water if and when it rained. And the fourth layer was simply goat skin, probably in this case used to keep out dust and sand as windstorms would pick up. As we see from the image, the tent is quite simple. There are just two rooms. The first room, there on the right side, was larger of the two and contained three pieces of furniture. It had a table, had a lampstand, and it had an altar. And that first room was referred to as the holy place. The second room, the one in the back, was a perfect 4.5 meter cube. It was the main room in the entire complex, and it contained the focal point of what everything led to, and one piece of furniture, the Ark of the Covenant. And in this room, only one person, the high priest, could enter this room, and they could only enter it on one day of the year, the Day of Atonement. And as we see in the image here, it is divided by a thick curtain. And as the description goes in the passage, of fine linen, dyed and stitched as the others. But this particular curtain was also embroidered with cherubim on the front. And it is this room where the Lord would descend, where he would dwell, and he would meet with his people. And it's referred to as the Holy of Holies, or what we might see throughout Scripture referred to as the most holy place. So that's the tabernacle. As we think of the whole complex, again, there's a few pieces of furniture throughout here, some in the courtyard, some in the holy place, and some in the Holy of Holies. Just outside the courtyard, or just inside the courtyard entrance, was the bronze altar. It would look something like this, a wooden box overlaid with bronze. It measured 2.5 meters square and about 1.5 meters in height, had a metal grating around the outside. As the tabernacle was meant to be moved from place to place as Israel moved around the wilderness, the altar was carried by wooden poles, also overlaid by bronze. And it was on this altar where the priest would offer burnt sacrifices, which the Lord commanded his people to offer before him. Looking at the courtyard again, in between the bronze altar and the tabernacle is the bronze basin, an item for ceremonial washing. It's actually not described in our text this morning. It's mentioned in Exodus 30, and as we move into that passage in a few weeks, we'll consider its construction and its purpose in the life of worship in Israel. If we move inside the tabernacle, there's 4 pieces of furniture that we see, 3 of them in the holy place and 1 in the Holy of Holies. The first thing that we see there on the right-hand side wall is the table for the bread of presence. And you can read of this in Exodus 25, verses 23 to 30. This was the size of an ordinary desk, probably much like the table that we have over here, about 1 meter wide, 1/2 meter deep, and about 3/4 of a meter high. Like the other pieces, it is made out of wood, but then this one is overlaid with gold. And it too had poles on which it could be carried from place to place. And its main function was to hold 12 loaves of bread, and those 12 loaves of bread represented the 12 tribes of Israel, and we'll consider the significance of that in just a moment. Sitting directly across from the table was the lampstands, Exodus 25, verses 31 to 40. And this piece was made out of one solid piece of gold, and it was hammered out to look like a flowering almond tree. It had 1 main stem and 6 branches, as represented here, enabling it to carry 7 lamps. We don't have any dimensions for this particular lampstand, but we are told that the piece of gold that it was hammered out of was to weigh a talent, or what would be equivalent to around 34 kilos. And so if we kind of think about that, it would probably be anywhere from 1 meter to 1.5 meters in height. Standing just in front of the curtain leading to the most holy place was another altar. And just like the bronze basin, this is something that we'll see later in Exodus 30, and we'll look at, again, its form and function in their worship, but this was known as the altar of incense. But the final piece, the piece that is in the Holy of Holies, the only piece of furniture in that room, is the Ark of the Covenant. Exodus 25, verses 10 through 22. And this is, again, really the focal point of the entire tabernacle. Everything led to and pointed and prepared for coming before this altar. The basic structure is 1 meter long, 3/4 of a meter wide, and about 3/4 of a meter high. It was a wooden chest. Like the other pieces, it is overlaid with pure gold. Also had poles upon which to carry it by. Uniquely, though, these poles were never to be removed from the altar. Inside the ark, it held 2 tablets of stone with the 10 Commandments on it. In the book of Hebrews, we read that it also contained an urn with manna and Aaron's staff. But really, what was on top of the ark is really what stands out in this entire area, in this entire dwelling. The lid of this ark was known as the mercy seat, or the atonement cover. This was a solid piece of gold with 2 cherubim on top. As we see in the image there, both of them facing each other with their faces downward in a position of reverent awe. And that is because it is here, at this point, in this place, on the mercy seat, where the Lord will meet with his people, where he will speak to them, where he is enthroned. Now, again, there is a lot of detail in these verses. We made a quick skim through them. Again, I encourage you to read through that passage if you haven't, and just, again, to begin to visualize this particular place of worship, this dwelling place, this tabernacle. You may not have noticed it from the outside, but again, the inside was beautiful. It was fit for a king, and that king is none other than the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Well, as we look at this section and the chapters coming up where much of this will be reiterated as Israel then builds the tabernacle according to the instructions that is given here, it's important that we don't get distracted by the details and by the instructions, but we allow them to communicate truth to us. And so for the remainder of our time this morning, we want to see 3 things that the tabernacle highlights about God and the gospel. God and the good news. The 3 things are God's holiness, God's presence, and God's promise. God's holiness, presence, and promise. The holiness of God is seen in many different ways in the tabernacle. The reality of being set apart or separate is quite noticeable. Again, a few examples of that. This tent stood out from all other tents surrounding it. It was separated by a wall. It was covered with layers of fabric. Not everyone was able to enter this complex. The people were required to stand outside. Only the priesthood could serve within the courtyard, and only the high priest could go into the most holy place. So it's clear that there is separateness going on here. The holiness of God, his purity and majesty, is seen as you go from the entrance of the tent into the complex. You know, the outside was made of fine linen and silver and copper. But as you go into the courtyard, you begin to come before more precious metals like bronze and gold. The tabernacle itself was covered with animal skin, quite plain. But inside it was beautiful and hung expensive tapestries. It was filled with furniture of gold, portions of it pure gold. And then there was the image of the cherubim, the guardians of the throne of God, bowing before the presence of the Lord. As you worked your way through the tabernacle towards the Ark of the Covenant, it became more and more evident that you were coming before holy God. But there are really 2 significant ways out of all of these that we see God's holiness. And that is protection and approach. Protection and approach. Yes, the Lord was in their midst. But we see here in this text is that they are protected from his all-consuming glory. The walls, the curtains that surrounded the complex kept people safe from the glory of God. Remember what we saw last week as we looked at Exodus 33 for a few moments. And the Lord tells Moses, no one can see my face and live. The truth is that sin separates us from God. We cannot approach him in our sin. And the tabernacle reminds Israel of that. And the tabernacle keeps them safe from his all-consuming glory. But it's not just the barriers. There's also the images of the cherubim, both on the curtain and on the mercy seats. The cherubim are angelic beings, and they're involved in the praise and the worship of the Lord. They're seen magnifying his power and his glory and his strength. They're also guardians of God's holiness. I mean, the first place we read of the cherubim are Genesis chapter 3, verse 24, where they're standing outside of the Garden of Eden. And what are they holding but flaming swords? Again, guarding the holiness of God. It's a reminder that it is no trivial act to come before God in the tabernacle. But secondly, the tabernacle highlights that there is a way to approach God. Yes, it keeps them safe, but there is a way to approach God. And notice that there are three entrances. There's the entrance on the outside, leading into the courtyard. There's the entrance leading into the tabernacle. There's the entrance leading into the Holy of Holies. God does not wall himself off completely. He dwells in their midst. He invites them in. How glorious is it that this sacred place has doorways? There's also an altar, a place for sacrifice, the atonement for sin. It's a reminder of God's righteousness and judgment, that he will deal with sin. But it also highlights his grace and his mercy, because what happens on that altar is a substitutionary sacrifice, allowing God's people to stand before him. Third, there is the ark, the throne of God. It's a reminder that the Lord is there. He is present. At the end of the book of Exodus, after the construction is completed, we read that the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Again, the God of the Bible is not a distant God. He is not unknowable, but he is there. He is present. He is personal. And his people can come before him, yes, approaching him according to his ways, but he invites them into his presence. It's an amazing truth. The holy God comes down to be with his people. And here in this place, they are both safe and welcomed. Well, the second thing this tabernacle highlights is the presence of God. We've already hinted at it. We've already seen it in some ways. But how glorious is it that God dwells with his people? The Lord's presence is seen in a number of ways. And seemingly, if you spend time, each and every element of the tabernacle and the courtyard point to his presence. I mean, just consider the walls themselves. We've already noted how the wall of curtain created a barrier. It created a separation. And what's the reason for that? God is there. And how this area worked is pictured back when God called Moses up onto the mountain. Right? Not everyone was able to touch Mount Sinai. Not everyone was able to enter the east entrance of the tabernacle. Not everyone was able to go up the mountain, but Moses and Aaron and the 70 elders, they went up on the mountain. Just as the priest will serve in the tabernacle, they will serve for the people. The reality is, even though there are these distinctions, everyone will be represented before God. The walls remind people that God is there. Upon entering, there was also the bronze altar. Again, a place of sacrifice. We've already noted how it points to God's holiness, but it also represents his presence. To come before God, sacrifice was necessary. Communion with God requires the shedding of blood. If we think about coming into this place, this was the very first thing you were confronted with, was this altar, this need for shed blood. It reminded of the gap between God and man. But it also pointed to his grace and his mercy. For the Lord's desire for his people to know him, to know of the way of salvation, to know of relationship with him. The bronze altar, although imposing, was at the same time a welcome sign. There can be communion with the Lord. We go to the tabernacle, the tent itself. It's another sign of God's presence. Two ways in particular. One, it was a dwelling, just like their dwelling. It was a dwelling in their midst of their dwellings. In a sense, God had moved into the neighborhoods. Secondly, the tabernacle was mobile, just like their dwellings. Israel was going to spend the next 40 years wandering around the wilderness. And this dwelling is not a fixed building. It will be packed up. It will be moved as they go from place to place. God is not in the best or the choicest spot. He's not hanging out where the wealthy and the prominent live. No, he is in the midst of his people wherever they are, the good times and the bad. He is there with his people. The furniture inside the tabernacle also highlight the presence of the Lord. First, there's the lampstand. Throughout the Bible, light speaks to God's presence. God is light. And notice, what is this light shining on? As it sits directly across from the table of the bread of presence, the 12 loaves, the presence of God is shining on Israel. One thing we didn't mention is the olive oil at the end of Exodus 25. The people in their contribution are to supply oil. And the lamp is to be regularly attended to, morning and evening, the oil filled, and it is to always be burning. Why is that? It is a picture of the presence of the Lord, who is continually with his people. He is their light. In the holy place, there is the table of the bread of presence. And the bread is really what is focused here. Not so much the table, as beautiful as it is, but the bread is teaching and proclaiming a truth. First, this is not a food offering to the Lord, but a symbol of each tribe of Israel. And each tribe is welcome to the Lord's table, to know and experience fellowship with the Lord and his blessing. Secondly, it was a reminder of the Lord's abundant provision. Every single week, this bread was replaced with freshly baked bread. The Lord is the one who feeds and sustains his people, both physically and spiritually. The third piece, the Ark of the Covenant. And here we see both the majesty and the mercy of God. Let me just meditate on the description of the ark for a moment. Pure gold, worshiping angels, a throne of majesty for the one true King. It's a place fit for God. But also we must notice what happens on this throne. Atonement is made. As the animals are sacrificed out on the bronze altar, the blood will be brought into the Holy of Holies. And it will be poured on the mercy seats. It was placed between the presence, the dwelling of God, and his law, which mankind had broken. Here was the place that pointed to God's judgment of sin and his mercy upon sinners. And so no matter where you went, no matter what you saw in the tabernacle, it was clear and evident that God was there. He had come to dwell with his people. But there is one more thing for us to see, and that is God's promise. God's promise, the gospel message. The form and function of the tabernacle causes us to look in two directions, to look backward and to look forward. It causes us to look backward to the Garden of Eden and forward to Jesus Christ. Looking backward, not only does the tabernacle mirror Eden, but it serves as a reminder of God's mercy shown as man sinned against the Lord. There are a number of ways in which the tabernacle mirrors or is like a mini Eden. I consider both of them have an east-facing entrance. And both of them at that entrance are guarded by cherubim. Both are richly beautiful. I mean, you read through Exodus 25 and 27, you can note all of the fine and expensive materials. Read through Genesis 1 and 2, and how often does the Lord look at creation and state, it is good. In both places there are trees. In Eden there is the tree of life. In the tabernacle there is the lampstand. Garden and tabernacle both have God's law. There's the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden. In the Ark of the Covenant are the 10 Commandments, both of which are God's good way. There's great provision. Adam and Eve are told to be fruitful and multiply, and they're given every blessing for that. The garden is theirs to expand and flourish. In the holy place, the loaves of bread on the table remind of God's sustaining and his providing. As we've just seen, both are places of God's presence, places where God meets man. But as we think about the events of Genesis chapter 3, we see how sin makes a mess of all of this, right? If you think about it, there is separation. Man is outside the garden, unable to come in because of the presence of the angel standing guards. God's law is rejected and broken, causing man to hide from God's presence. That which was beautiful, that which was a delight for man to work, has been cursed. And yet, as we see in Genesis 3, there is a promise. There's a promise of a coming Messiah, the one who will come and perfectly obey God's law, restore relationship with God, and in all reality, restore creation. One who is the very presence of God himself. And it's that where we begin to see the tabernacle pointing forward to the person and work of Jesus Christ. How does John introduce Jesus in John 1? He is the Word become flesh, God with us. We're going to sing of this in a few weeks during Christmas, right? Emmanuel, God with us. He has come to dwell in our midst. And all that we see in the tabernacle is but a foretaste of Christ and his work. For Israel, there is a prescribed way to meet God. We're told in the New Testament, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. We approach God his way through Jesus. Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. We're told later in the book of Leviticus that the fire on the altar was required to always be burning, never to go out. Sacrifice was to be made day after day, week after week, year after year, century after century. But Jesus is the once-for-all sacrifice. He is the one true sacrifice. He is the source of salvation and forgiveness. We also need to note that his sacrifice has torn the veil in the Holy of Holies. There was the significant moment in human history as Jesus is hanging on the cross. And the veil is torn from top to bottom. His sacrifice provides direct access to God. How about provision? The bread, right? What does Jesus say in the New Testament? I am the bread. Come to him and you will not perish. You will find full and complete nourishment for the soul. Just like the lampstand, reminding that God is light, Jesus is the light of the world. He is the true light. He shines the light of truth in our hearts, and we no longer live in darkness, but we live in the light of Jesus Christ. He is the atonement for our sin. He satisfies the wrath of God towards sin, as pictured in the Ark of the Covenant. As God would in a sense, look at the shed blood on the mercy seat, in between his wrath and the law which is broken. God looks upon lawbreakers and rebels like us, and he sees Jesus, his righteousness, his shed blood. As you continue to read the scriptures, though, you see that Jesus is bringing us back to Eden, or more appropriately put, to a place that is even better than Eden. And in this way, the tabernacle looks forward to the end of the Bible, to the book of Revelation, when we read of a holy city, the New Jerusalem, where it is said, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man, where the Lamb is seated on the throne, and there is no need for lights, because the presence of God in the Lamb fills the entire place with lights, where every blessing is bestowed on God's people. The tree of life bearing fruit forever. A city that is full of gold and precious stones. A place full of angelic worship where angels do not guard against mankind's entrance, but where man is free to enter. And I love how it speaks of the city, the holy city as having 12 entrances. A place where God will dwell with them, where they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. How glorious is the message of the tabernacle. It is not just a list of instructions for building a building, but it is the good news of the gospel for those who are in desperate need. In closing, I'm just going to read the words of Hebrews 10, verses 19 through 23. The book of Hebrews contains a lot of Old Testament themes and references. And here in these verses, we pick up the picture of the tabernacle. And it's a great reminder to us as God's people this morning. Hebrews 10:19-23. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is through his flesh, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful.